Today, we'll be going over what a feature flag is and some of the use cases for when you should use a feature flag to conditionally go down different code paths. So in our first example here, we want to redesign the settings page on our website. In the original version, we have 6 different components in our sidebar, and we want to refactor it to just 2. One of the problems that you need to solve is how can you conditionally determine which page the user should see? You want to continue to serve traffic to the original page, but you also want your developers to build in the new page in the code base. But you don't necessarily want to expose that new page until it's ready. You need a way to determine when you're ready to launch this page and how many people should see that new page. And this is something that a feature flag can solve. How it works is when your user goes to the settings page, you first ask, is the feature flag for the redesign of this page is enabled? This value right here, you as a developer and you as a business has control over it. What it does is calls your feature flag service, and you have control over whether or not the user should see the new page or if they should continue to see the old page. When you're ready to launch, you set this value to true and you show the user the new page. If you're not ready, you continue down the original path. So from the user's perspective, nothing changes, but you're still able to develop this new page and launch it to your user when it's ready. Let's see this in action. Here we have a use feature flag hook. It makes an API call to our feature flag service. So that hook is responsible for this part right here, that is redesign enabled. It makes an API call to your feature flag service by passing in a feature flag name. The result of this API call will determine whether or not the redesign is enabled. If we're ready to launch it, we set the value of the API call to true. If we're not ready, we set it to false. In your settings component, when your user goes to the /settings page, it gets returned this component right here. What it first does is calls the use feature flag hook with the settings page redesign feature flag. If it's true, we return the v2. If it returns false, we return the original. This is how you're able to use a feature flag to conditionally render when you want to showcase the new page or the old page. You as a developer and as a business have control over when this feature is enabled. So that's how you're able to determine whether or not a user should see the new experience or not. And feature flags aren't specific to just front-end examples. You can also use a feature flag for back-end stuff. So in our example here, we want to migrate how we store profile images from Azure onto AWS. So whenever a user makes an API request to get their profile image, we first check, is this Azure to AWS migration enabled? If it's not enabled, you continue to use Azure to serve the profile image. Once you finish migrating to AWS and you're ready to launch that new version, you set this value, that is migration enabled, to yes, and you use the AWS implementation. Behind the scenes, developers are migrating all the data from Azure onto AWS. This allows you to do the migration process and then launch the AWS version of storing profile images once you're ready. So this is an example of what the code would look like. So here, our get profile image method, it takes in a user ID and it first checks, is the feature flag enabled for the Azure to AWS blob storage? That line right there corresponds with this field right here, is migration enabled. If it's yes, we return the AWS version. If it's no, continue with Azure. So right here, AWS S3 profile images, we won't use the AWS version if the feature flag is enabled. Else continue to use Azure. In the examples I've shown you, we're kind of going from 0% to 100%. Once the migration is ready, we immediately send all of the traffic from the Azure version onto the AWS. Or in the other example, when our settings page redesign is finished, we immediately go from the original onto the new. But you want some sort of way to incrementally roll out these changes. You want to test that the new version does not have any bugs and that the performance of the changes you make isn't impacting your users. You don't want to go from 0% of your users seeing the new page all the way up to 100, because if there's an issue, 100% of your users are going to see that issue. So you want a way to incrementally dial up how much percent of your users see the new experience. When you get to this branch of the is feature flag enabled, you kind of want to say something like, hey, I only want 10% of my users to see the new page and then 90% see the old one. Once I make sure that everything looks good, I can now say, hey, let's have 50% of our users see the new one. Let's have 75% of our users see the new one, all the way up to 100%. So how can you configure a way to make sure that only a certain amount of percent of users can see the new experience? This is what that process would look like. Whenever you're ready to launch a new feature, this is kind of how the process would go. Your developers and your stakeholders would have some sort of access to an admin UI. This could be a web interface to set the percentage of users that could see the new experience, or this could be a direct database query to how wherever it stores this percentage. When you first launch a new experience, you only want a small percent of your users to see the new experience. Your developer or your stakeholder will set only 10% of your users to see the new experience. Then behind the scenes, your devs would monitor the logs and the metrics to make sure performance is good, there's no errors, and that everything is looking green. Once you're confident that 10% of our users are seeing good traffic, you incrementally dial up to 25%. And then you repeat the same process. You monitor the logs and the metrics, and if that looks good, you go up to 50, then 75%, then 100%. If at any point you start seeing issues, right? Let's say you reach 50% and you find a new bug, you're able, as a developer, set these percentages back to 0%. That way, you go back to the original version of your page and you can debug and further root cause the issues. So right here is redesign flag enabled. When you set the feature flag value percentages to 10%, 10% is seeing the new experience, 90% is seeing the old. Once you go to 25, 25% see the new, 75% see the old, and you continue that process all the way up to 100%. One thing that feature flags are good at is running tests on your website. So for example, let's say our product manager has a hypothesis saying that if we change the buy button color on our website, we will receive more clicks on the buy button, and that'll drive revenue and profits for our business. So how can you run some sort of test and experiment on this? Some data points that you want to collect is the ratio of clicks to views on the buy button. If we're able to collect the amount of views to clicks on the buy button, that gives us some data points to convince stakeholders saying, yes, we verified that if you change the buy button color, we receive more clicks on it. So how can you gather data like this and run a test like this? So here, this is an example of the buy button component that we've talked about. So first, you will create a feature flag for the buy button color test. You will call this use feature flag hook, and you also have a hook called use analytics. And what this hook does is it just emits a record and an entry that, one, you've either viewed the buy button, or two, you've clicked on the buy button. That gives your business data and insights on the click to view ratio. Every time you run into a component, you emit a metric saying the new buy button color or the original buy button color has been viewed, depending on the feature flag value. And your buy button component, whenever you click on the buy button, you record a metric saying the new button has been clicked or the original button has been clicked, depending on the feature that you're seeing, either the original or the new one. That way, you're collecting the data of how many times the buy button has been viewed versus how many times it has been clicked. How you run this test is you first launch the new buy button color to 10% of your users. Then you wait a few days to gather all the data and the metrics regarding how many people viewed versus clicked on the buy button. If you see a higher ratio of clicks to views between the new one and the old one, that gives us some data points and some insights saying that the new buy button color does indeed increase traffic to the amount of clicks on the buy button. If we're confident that that's the case, we can dial up to 25% and repeat that process. If you see similar data points, we continue to dial this up all the way up to 100%. Now that we've talked about how feature flags are implemented, I kind of want to talk about how you know which user should see which experience. Because in our example with the settings page, let's say we have user ID 12345. We want to make it so then that if user 12345 sees a new page today, when they log back in tomorrow, they should still see the new page. We don't want to make it that on day one, they see the new page, and then the next day, they see the old page. That would lead to an inconsistent experience. You want to make it so that they consistently have the same feature flag value. So how can you implement something like this? How it works is when you're given a unique ID, so it could be the customer ID, maybe a VIN number, an ASIN, an ISBN number, some sort of unique identifier. So in our case, we're going to be using our customer ID as an example, or a user ID. When you pass in that ID, you compute a hash value. And that hashing function gives you a value between 0 and 100. So this 0 and 100 value corresponds with what percentage of our users see the old or the new experience, right? That corresponds with these numbers right here. So let's say user ID 12345 gets hashed to a value of 75. So that point right here. Let's say we launched our feature flag to only 50% of our users. Since the hash value of 75 does not fall into this range, they are going to see the old experience. But once we launch to, let's say, 80% of our users, they fall into this range of people that should see the new experience. So in that case, we start serving them the new page. That way, you give a consistent experience of when user ID 12345 logs on to our website, they should see the new experience once we launched at 80%. And then when they come back tomorrow, they're going to see the same value because of this hashing value. It will always be consistent no matter what. So right here, when I pass in user ID 12345, it always gets hashed to about 75. And only once that our launch value have exceeded that point and falls into that range is when they should see the new experience. So that is how feature flags work and when you should use feature flags in your website and your backend stuff. Hope you learned something new. Take care. Bye.